I shot Bigfoot, retired soldier's bone-chilling encounter in the forest. That's not just a title. That's exactly what happened. A decorated soldier, fresh out of the army, moved into the quiet woods of Arkansas to heal and live in peace. But the forest he thought he knew was hiding something. Something watching him. First came the stench, like wet dog and rot drifting on the wind. Then the silence, so complete it felt like the world had stopped. And finally, huge tracks in the riverbank mud, 5 toes spread wide like a barefoot giant. One night, circling, footsteps closed in on his cabin. A towering shadow moved across the window. His instincts took over. The gun went off. But at sunrise there was no body, no blood, only a strand of hair and a nest of broken branches woven by something that wasn't supposed to exist. If a soldier trained for war couldn't face what walked those woods, then what did he really shoot at? You found your way here for a reason. In a world that can feel overwhelming, it's the gentle hearts that bring light, and yours is one of them. After 20 years in the army, I finally made it back to the Ozark Highlands. Not just for a visit this time, for good. The familiar scent of pine and oak filled my lungs as I stood on the worn wooden deck of what was now my cabin, watching the October sun sink behind the ridgeline. The property wasn't much. 800 square feet of living space, a metal roof that needed some attention, and 5 acres of dense forest backing up to thousands of acres of public land. But it was mine, paid for with combat pay I'd been saving. Since my first deployment, I'd grown up not 30 miles from here, learning to hunt these hills with my father before I enlisted. Back then, I thought I knew these woods. Now, after 2 decades of military precision and tactical awareness, I found myself having to consciously slow down to quiet the part of my brain always scanning for threats. These weren't mountain ranges in Afghanistan. No IEDs hidden beneath the leaf litter. Just white-tailed deer trails and turkey scratches in the soft earth. The cabin needed work, but I approached it like any other mission. First week, I replaced rotted boards on the deck, cleaned the chimney, and installed a new water pump. My tools were arranged with military efficiency, everything in its place, everything accounted for. Old habits die hard. Even my MREs were stored by date, though I planned to phase them out once I got my chest freezer stocked with venison. Each morning, I'd wake at 0500 or 500 hours, I reminded myself. I needed to start talking like a civilian again. The pre-dawn ritual was simple. Coffee on the propane stove, weather check on the battery-powered radio, gear inspection. My compound bow and arrows were maintained with the same attention to detail I once gave my service weapons. I spent those first weeks learning the land, made detailed notes in my field journal, marking game trails, bedding areas, water sources, drew my own topographical maps to supplement the official ones, noting features the USGS surveys missed, a fallen oak creating a natural bridge across Cedar Creek, a limestone outcropping that offered a perfect spot to glass the valley below. Locals at the general store in Marshall treated me with a mix of respect and wariness when I'd go in for supplies. They could spot a veteran easily enough. The way I positioned myself with clear sight lines to all exits. How I unconsciously tracked everyone who entered. Ms. Betty, who ran the register, would always thank me for my service. I'd nod politely, but what I really wanted was to shed that identity, to become just another hunter in the hills. My father used to say these mountains had their own heartbeat, their own way of teaching patience to those willing to listen. I was trying to learn that lesson again, to trade the sharp edges of military precision for something softer. But 2 decades of training don't fade quickly. I still maintained a perimeter check before sunset, still kept my tactical flashlight and sidearm within reach at night, still found myself analyzing every snapped twig or rustling leaf with the heightened awareness that had kept me alive in combat. The bow season would open soon. I spent hours at my makeshift range, practicing shots from various positions and distances, the repetitive motion of knocking arrows, drawing, releasing. It was meditative in a way that helped quiet the hypervigilance. When I was focused on the target, the world narrowed to breath and aim, wind and distance. In those moments, I could almost forget the weight of body armor, the crack of gunfire, the constant tension of waiting for something to go wrong. This was supposed to be my fresh start, a return to simpler times, to the woods that had shaped my childhood. But as October deepened and the leaves began to turn, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still operating in a combat zone, just a different kind. Maybe that's why I kept my field journal so meticulously, recorded every detail of my days with military precision. Old habits might die hard, but they'd kept me alive this long. I just had to find a way to balance that training with the peace I'd come here seeking. The first few weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm. I'd spend my mornings maintaining the cabin and afternoons scouting the surrounding forest, marking promising spots for the upcoming deer season. The transition from military life to civilian solitude was jarring at first. No more constant background noise of vehicles, aircraft, or hundreds of soldiers going about their duties. Here, I could actually hear myself think. Initially, that silence felt like a gift. After 20 years of shared barracks, forward operating bases, and the perpetual symphony of military operations, having space to breathe without someone else's schedule dictating my movements seemed almost luxurious. I'd sit on my deck in the early morning, drinking coffee and listening to the forest wake up. No radio chatter, no equipment maintenance schedules, no briefings to attend. But something about the quiet started nagging at me around day 10. I noticed it first while checking a promising ridge about 2 miles east of my cabin. The morning had started normally enough. Wood thrushes singing their fluted songs, squirrels chattering as they gathered acorns, the occasional crow calling from deeper in the valley. Then, without warning or obvious cause, everything just stopped. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was complete. No wind in the leaves, no birds, no insects. Even the constant background hum of crickets and katydids vanished. The first time it happened, I dropped into a defensive crouch before I could stop myself, scanning the tree line with the same intensity I'd used on patrol. Nothing moved. After 5 minutes, the forest sounds gradually returned, like someone slowly turning up nature's volume. I told myself it was normal. Woods go quiet sometimes when a predator passes through. Every hunter knows that. But this felt different from the brief hush that follows a coyote or bobcat. This silence had weight to it, a presence that seemed to press against my eardrums. The pattern repeated itself over the next few days. I'd be going about my routine, checking trail cameras, practicing with my bow, or just hiking the property lines, when that absolute silence would descend. Sometimes it lasted only a minute or two, other times up to 15 minutes by my watch. I started marking the locations in my field journal, trying to find some geographic correlation, but the incidents seemed random. One afternoon, I was fieldy, dressing my topographic maps at the kitchen table when the silence fell again. Inside the cabin this time, which was new, the constant tick of my wall clock suddenly seemed deafening in the absence of all other sound. I stood perfectly still, listening with everything I had. 20 years of training had taught me to trust my instincts, and every one of them was telling me something was wrong with this silence. I found myself adding new items to my daily security checks, started carrying my sidearm more regularly even though I'd promised myself I wouldn't fall back on that particular military habit. I set up a few simple warning systems around the cabin perimeter. Nothing elaborate, just some fishing line with small bells attached at strategic points. The kind of thing we used to rig in the sandbox when the local situation got sporty. The rational part of my brain knew I was probably overreacting. This was the Ozarks, not a combat zone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that these episodes of silence weren't natural. In combat, we had a saying, silence is the sound of observation. When everything goes quiet, it usually means something is watching, waiting, gathering intelligence. I'd learned to trust that instinct the hard way. I started timing the silent periods, recording them in my journal with the same precision I'd once used for after-action reports. Date, time, duration, location, weather conditions, anything that might reveal a pattern. So far, the only consistency was their inconsistency. They could happen at any time of day, in any weather, anywhere on my property or the surrounding public land. It was a crisp October morning when I first caught the smell. I'd been working my way along the eastern ridge, marking potential deer stands for the upcoming season, when a gust of wind brought it down from higher ground. The odor hit me like a physical force, a nauseating mixture of wet dog and advanced decomposition, with an underlying musk I couldn't quite place. 20 years in the military had acquainted me with plenty of unpleasant smells, but this was distinctly different. My first thought was a deer carcass. It was common enough to find them in the woods, especially after the first frost when animals weakened by disease or injury finally succumbed. I adjusted my route to track the scent upwind, more out of professional curiosity than anything else. If there was a dead deer up there, I wanted to know about it. Predators drawn to carrion could affect hunting patterns later in the season. The smell grew stronger as I climbed, becoming almost overwhelming near the ridgeline. I pulled my shirt, collar up over my nose, breathing through the fabric as I searched the area methodically. The ground was thick with fallen leaves, but I could see no sign of disturbance that would indicate a large carcass. No buzzards circled overhead, which was unusual. They typically found dead animals within hours around here. I spent 45 minutes quartering the ridge in a standard search pattern, the same way we'd sweep areas for cached weapons or hidden threats overseas. Nothing. No carcass, no bones, no sign of predator activity, just that powerful stench that seemed to come and go with the wind. Eventually, I had to abandon the search. The smell was making my eyes water, and I had other areas to scout before sunset. Throughout the day, I couldn't shake the memory of that odor. It wasn't just the intensity that bothered me. It was how quickly it had appeared and disappeared, almost as if its source was mobile. But that didn't make sense. Any animal large enough to produce that kind of smell would have left obvious signs of its passage. I returned to the cabin late in the afternoon, spent some time organizing my topographic maps and updating my scouting notes. The sun was setting when I stepped onto the deck to check the weather. The temperature had dropped several degrees, and a light fog was forming in the hollows below my position. That's when I heard it. A knock. Clear and deliberate, like someone striking a hollow log with a solid piece of wood. It echoed across the hollow from the direction of the ridge I'd searched earlier, the sound carrying easily in the still evening air. One knock, then silence. My combat-trained mind automatically recorded the details. Direction: approximately 800 yards, east-southeast, likely origin point near the elevation where I'd encountered the smell that morning. The sound wasn't particularly loud, but something about its clarity made the hair on my neck stand up. It had none of the random quality of natural forest sounds. This was purposeful. I stood motionless on the deck, listening intently. In my head, I began counting seconds, the same way I used to time intervals between mortar rounds. 30 seconds passed. 60. Nothing. Just the normal sounds of the forest settling into night. Part of me wanted to dismiss it. Plenty of natural things could make knocking sounds in the woods. Dead trees falling against each other, branches breaking, even certain woodpeckers. But those explanations felt hollow. The precision of that single knock stuck with me, like a signal or a message I wasn't equipped to decode. I made a mental note of the time and location, adding it to my growing list of anomalies. At this point, I wasn't ready to call it suspicious. Just another detail to track, another piece of data to file away. But as I went back inside to prepare dinner, I found myself double-checking the locks on my doors and windows. Old habits die hard, I told myself. Just standard security procedures. 3 days after hearing that knock, I was working my way along one of my regular trails, a narrow track I'd walked dozens of times since buying the cabin. The morning was cool and damp, typical for mid-October, in the Ozarks. I'd started early, hoping to check my trail cameras before heading into town for supplies. About 2 miles in, something caught my eye that made me stop dead in my tracks. The trail ahead was partially obscured by what looked like a series of crude archways, formed by young saplings bent over the path. I counted 6 of them, spaced roughly 10 feet apart, creating a tunnel-like effect that stretched for about 60 feet. My first thought was storm damage, but that didn't hold up to scrutiny. These saplings, mostly young hickory and oak, were deliberately bent and twisted together. Some were even wrapped around each other in a way that couldn't have occurred naturally. The formations were too uniform, too purposeful. Each arch stood approximately 8 feet tall at its peak, well above head height. I approached the first arch cautiously, examining the construction. The trees hadn't been cut or broken. They'd been bent while still living, their trunks curved and grown into these shapes over time. This wasn't recent work. Based on the bark growth patterns and healing around the bends, I estimated these modifications had been made at least 2 seasons ago. What bothered me most was that I hadn't noticed them before. I'd hiked this trail regularly since spring, and, while the surrounding vegetation had been thicker then, these arches were substantial structures. They should have been obvious. Drawing on my military training, I conducted a detailed site survey. No footprints in the surrounding soil, though recent rains had likely washed any away. No discarded materials or tools. No signs of recent human activity at all. The forest floor beneath the arches was clear of debris, creating an unnatural-looking corridor through the woods. Probably just kids, I muttered to myself, though I knew that explanation didn't fit. This location was at least 4 miles from the nearest road or house. The work required to bend and secure these saplings would have taken considerable time and effort. This wasn't the kind of casual vandalism you typically see in public recreation areas. Poachers crossed my mind next. Maybe this was some kind of trail marker system, though it seemed unnecessarily elaborate. In my experience, poachers preferred simpler methods: blazes on trees, bits of colored tape, or GPS coordinates. I took out my disposable camera and snapped several photos, making sure to capture the regular spacing and the detail of how the saplings were woven together. Then I pulled out my topographic map and marked the exact location. Something about these arches felt like a message, or a boundary marker, though I couldn't articulate why that thought occurred to me. As I stood there studying the structures, that same unnatural silence I'd noticed before settled over the forest. No birds, no squirrels. Even the ever-present insects seemed to have gone quiet. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself unconsciously shifting into a defensive posture, scanning the tree line with practiced precision. After a few minutes, I forced myself to relax. I was letting my imagination run wild, falling back on combat instincts that had no place in these peaceful woods. This was civilian territory, private land. There had to be a rational explanation for these arches, even if I couldn't see it yet. I continued down the trail, ducking slightly as I passed under each arch despite their ample height. Something made me want to minimize contact with them. Once I cleared the last one, I picked up my pace slightly, telling myself it was just to make up for lost time, but I knew that wasn't entirely true. A week after discovering those strange arches, I decided to try my luck along Cedar Creek. The morning was crisp, with patches of fog still clinging to the water. I'd spotted promising deer sign in the area, and with bow season in full swing, I was eager to fill my freezer. I moved slowly along the creek bank, careful to stay in the shadows. 20 years in the army taught me the value of patience and precise movement. Every few steps, I'd pause, scan, and listen. The creek's gentle burble provided good sound cover, and a light breeze carried my scent away from where I expected the deer to emerge. About half a mile downstream from my usual crossing point, something caught my eye that made me freeze. At first, I thought I was looking at bear tracks in the creek bank's soft mud. But bears weren't common in this part of Arkansas, and these prints didn't match any bear sign I'd ever seen. I crouched down for a closer look, my bow temporarily forgotten. The tracks were unmistakably foot-shaped, 5 toes, a broad ball, and a distinct heel. But the proportions were all wrong. Each print was at least 15 inches long and 8 inches wide at the toes. which splayed out in a way that suggested they'd never been confined by shoes. My own boot prints were visible in the mud nearby, providing an unsettling comparison. Despite my 210 pounds of weight, plus gear, my tracks were significantly shallower than these impressions. Whatever had made these prints was heavy, far heavier than any human I'd ever encountered. I pulled out my disposable camera, grateful I'd made a habit of carrying it. The morning light was still dim, so I cleared some vegetation to allow better illumination of the tracks. I placed my hunting knife beside one print for scale and took several photos from different angles. The mud had preserved remarkable detail. I could make out individual toe prints and what looked like dermal ridges, like massive fingerprints. The tracks followed the creek for about 30 yards before vanishing into a rocky area. They appeared fresh, probably from the previous night when the ground was still damp from an evening shower. The stride length averaged around 4 feet, suggesting a natural walking gait for whatever had made them. My military training kicked in as I analysed the scene. These weren't fake prints. The weight distribution and subtle signs of movement were too perfect, too natural. The toes had gripped the mud as the foot pushed off, leaving distinct clawless grooves. The heel strikes showed clear pressure points that would be extremely difficult to fake. I found myself unconsciously gripping my bow tighter, scanning the surrounding forest with new intensity. The woods suddenly felt different, less like the solitary refuge I'd been seeking and more like someone else's territory. Years of combat experience had taught me to trust my instincts, and right now, every nerve in my body was telling me I wasn't alone. The creek's peaceful burble now seemed to mask potential sounds of movement. The morning fog, which had earlier added to the hunting atmosphere, now concealed too much of the surrounding forest. I realized I'd been so focused on the tracks that I'd lost awareness of my surroundings, a rookie mistake I'd trained countless soldiers not to make. I took a few more photos, then carefully backed away from the creek. My deer hunt was forgotten. All I wanted now was to get back to my cabin and develop these photos. 20 years of military service had taught me to document everything, to gather evidence before drawing conclusions. But it had also taught me that sometimes the obvious explanation, however improbable, is the correct one. These weren't bear tracks. They weren't human tracks. And they definitely weren't the product of local kids playing pranks. Something large, heavy, and bipedal had walked this creek bank in the night, and I needed to reevaluate everything I thought I knew about these woods. Over the next few days, I started noticing changes in the forest behavior that sent chills down my spine. As a hunter, I'd learned to read the woods like a book. But now, the familiar text seemed to be written in a different language. The first pattern emerged during my morning hunts. I'd be settled in my tree stand before dawn, listening to the forest wake up, the usual progression of birds, squirrels, and other small creatures going about their business. Then, without warning, a wave of silence would sweep through like an invisible tide. Not the gradual quiet that comes when a predator passes through, but an immediate, total hush that felt deliberate. In these moments of unnatural quiet, I'd hear movement, careful, measured footsteps that seemed to circle my position at a distance just beyond my visual range. My combat instincts, honed through 4 tours overseas, began screaming at me. This wasn't the random wandering of deer or the purposeful prowl of a mountain lion. These movements followed tactical patterns, like the careful positioning of a patrol trying to maintain visual contact while avoiding detection. The realization made my hands shake on my rifle. During one afternoon hunt, I caught a flash of movement about 70 yards out, something tall and dark moving with fluid grace between the trees. My first thought was person, but the motion was wrong. Too smooth, too efficient for someone navigating dense underbrush. When I shifted position to get a better look, whatever it was had vanished, leaving only swaying branches in its wake. These glimpses became more frequent, always in my peripheral vision, always just far enough away to maintain plausible deniability. A dark shape here, a subtle movement there. The thing that struck me most was the intelligence behind the movements. Whatever was watching me understood, sightlines and cover, moving only when it had concealment, freezing when exposed. The feeling of being shadowed grew stronger with each passing day. I'd catch that now familiar scent, wet dog and decay, moments before the silence fell. Sometimes I'd find fresh tracks overlapping my own from the previous day, as if something had backtracked my path after I'd left. The implications turned my stomach. This wasn't random. I was being studied. One morning, I found myself automatically running threat assessments like I used to do in Afghanistan, identifying escape routes, calculating fields of fire, noting potential choke points. My hands kept returning to my rifle's familiar grip, muscle memory from too many tense patrols surfacing unbidden. The peaceful retirement I'd imagined was eroding into hypervigilance and combat reflexes. The worst moments came in the pre-dawn darkness. I'd be walking to my hunting spot, headlamp illuminating the narrow tunnel ahead, when I'd hear synchronized movement in the black void beyond my light's reach. Something matching my pace, mirroring my stops and starts with military precision. The behavior was too deliberate to be coincidence, too controlled to be animal, yet too fluid to be human. These encounters left me with a growing certainty that I was dealing with something that understood strategy, something that was systematically testing my routines and responses. Just like we used to probe enemy positions to gauge their security patterns, I was being evaluated. The realization brought back memories of night operations in hostile territory, that constant tension of being both hunter and hunted. My training had taught me to trust these instincts. In combat zones, ignoring such patterns usually meant someone died. But here, in what was supposed to be my peaceful retirement, I found myself falling back into battlefield habits, varying my routes, checking my six, maintaining mental maps of cover and concealment. The forest I'd hoped would heal my combat-worn psyche was instead becoming another tactical problem to solve. The unease began to feel like a physical weight, pressing against my chest with each crack of a branch or rustle of leaves. My cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt exposed. I started double-checking locks, keeping weapons closer at hand, sleeping lighter. The woods were no longer my refuge. They had become a green ocean where something intelligent was circling just below the surface, watching, waiting, learning. That night, I was cleaning my bow when the first knock echoed across the valley. It was 9:45 p.m., and the sound carried with remarkable clarity through the crisp autumn air. 3 distinct impacts, wood on wood, evenly spaced, about 2 seconds apart. The sequence was too regular to be natural, too powerful to be casual. I set down my bow and moved to the cabin's west window, straining to pinpoint the source. The knock had come from the ridge across Miller's Creek, maybe half a mile out. As I stood there listening, another series of knocks answered from the opposite direction, this time from the higher ground near Black Oak Ridge. The sound was similar, but deeper, as if made with a heavier implement. My military training kicked in. As I analyzed the acoustics, these impacts were carrying at least 3/4 of a mile, probably more. The force required to project sound that far through dense forest wasn't something a single person could easily manage while moving between locations. Besides, the timing between the call and response was too quick. Nobody could cover that distance, in the dark that fast. The knocking continued for almost 20 minutes, a rhythmic conversation between at least 2 positions. The cadence felt deliberate, almost like a code. I'd heard hunters use similar signals before, but this was different. Traditional hunting signals tend to be simple. 2 shorts for come, here, 3 for I'm done, that sort of thing. This was more complex, with varying intervals and intensities that suggested actual communication. That night, sleep proved elusive. I lay in bed with my rifle propped against the headboard instead of in its usual place in the gun safe. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf outside had me tensing, straining to identify the source. The rational part of my brain tried to explain it away. Other hunters must be setting up for the season, maybe using some new signaling system I hadn't heard of. But 20 years in the army had taught me to trust my instincts, and everything about those knocks felt wrong. The timing was off. Most hunters would be long out of the woods by that hour. The power behind the impacts was concerning. It reminded me more of mortar fire than human-made signals. And that complex rhythm, it wasn't random, but it didn't follow any pattern I recognized from 2 decades of military communications training. I dozed fitfully, waking every hour or so to check the windows and doors. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. That same powerful knock, this time closer, maybe just a few hundred yards out. I sat up, rifle in hand, and waited for a response. When it came, the answering knock was from yet another position, creating a rough triangle around my cabin. The sounds continued sporadically until dawn, never close enough to pinpoint but always present, like a perimeter being maintained. With each series of knocks, I felt my grip on normal explanations slipping. The precision, the power, the complexity of the exchanges, none of it fit with what I knew about human behavior in these woods. By morning, exhaustion had left me raw-nerved and jumpy. I found myself doing what I'd done countless times in combat zones, calculating fields of fire from my windows, mentally marking likely approach routes, planning fallback positions. The rifle stayed within arm's reach as I made coffee, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line through the kitchen window. I told myself I was overreacting, that my combat-trained mind was seeing threats where none existed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there was coordinating, communicating, and quite possibly planning. The knocks weren't random noise. They were signals, deliberate and purposeful, being exchanged by something that understood the concept of maintaining a security perimeter. The evening started like any other, with me heating up some canned stew on my small propane stove. It was 7:15 p.m. when I first heard it, a heavy footfall on the east side of the cabin. Not the light scampering of deer or the padding of a bear, but something with weight and purpose. The steps were slow, methodical, like military patrol, spacing. I killed the stove and lights immediately, moving to retrieve my rifle from beside the bed. 20 years of combat training took over as I positioned myself away from windows, controlling my breathing as I listened. The footsteps continued their circuit, crunching through the fallen leaves with a steady rhythm that spoke of two-legged movement. The moon was 3/4 full, casting enough light to create deep shadows among the trees. As the steps rounded, toward the north side of the cabin, I could hear branches being pushed aside, not broken, but deliberately moved. Whatever was out there stood tall enough to reach above head height. My hands tightened on the rifle as the footfalls paused near my woodpile. There was a sound like deep breathing, followed by what I can only describe as sniffing. Loud, purposeful inhalations that reminded me of tracking dogs catching a scent. The hair on my neck stood up as I realized it was likely catching my scent through the cabin walls. The steps resumed, slower now, more cautious. I tracked the sound as it moved west, then south, completing a full circle of my cabin. My finger rested alongside the trigger guard, not on the trigger. Proper discipline, even in this situation. But when the movement stopped directly outside my bedroom window, that discipline was tested. A shadow fell across the glass, massive, broader than any man I'd ever seen. The moonlight caught something that might have been an arm reaching toward the window frame. In that moment, my combat reflexes took control. The rifle came up, my finger found the trigger, and I fired a single shot through the window. The glass shattered with a crash that was immediately drowned out by something between a roar and a scream, a sound that hit frequencies I'd never heard from any known animal. The shadow vanished as whatever it was crashed away through the underbrush, snapping branches and small trees in its retreat. I maintained my firing position, tracking the sound of its withdrawal up the eastern ridge. The forest erupted in a cascade of breaking branches and thundering impacts that gradually faded into the distance. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. Not just quiet, utterly, completely still. No insects, no night birds, nothing. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like hours, though my watch showed only 45 minutes had passed. My hands were steady on the rifle, training again, but my mind was racing. What had I just done? Had I shot at a person? A bear? Something else? The size of that shadow and the power of its retreat argued against normal explanations. When I finally moved to examine the window, I found the glass scattered across the floor and a single 30-06 hole in the screen. There was no blood that I could see, no sign of a hit, but the ground outside showed clear signs of something large having stood there. The soil was compressed in a way that made my boot prints look insignificant by comparison. I spent the rest of the night in the corner with the best fields of fire, my back to the wall, rifle ready. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves had me tensing, expecting retaliation. But nothing came. The forest remained locked in that unnatural silence until dawn began to creep over the ridge. As light returned, I found myself questioning everything: my decision to fire, my judgment of the threat, even my own perceptions. Had combat left, me too quick to react with violence? Or had my military instincts saved me from something I still couldn't bring myself to name? As the first hints of dawn began filtering through the trees, I methodically checked my weapon, secured fresh magazines, and prepared to investigate. The temperature had dropped to near 40 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and my breath formed small clouds as I stepped out onto the cabin's wooden porch. The morning dew had settled heavily, making the ground conditions ideal for tracking. I approached, the window first, maintaining tactical awareness of my surroundings. The shattered glass crunched under my boots as I examined the window frame. That's when I spotted it, a coarse strand of dark hair, about 8 inches long, snagged in the splintered wood where the screen had torn. It was thicker than human hair, but not quite as coarse as bear fur. The colour was a deep brown-black that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the early morning light. I carefully extracted it using my multi-tool and sealed it in a plastic bag from my kit. The ground beneath the window told its own story. The compression marks I'd noticed the night before were even more apparent in the morning light. Whatever had stood there had distributed its weight differently than a human or known predator would. The stance was wider, more planted, suggesting something that moved primarily on 2 legs rather than 4. Following standard tracking procedure, I began working outward in expanding circles from the cabin. The trail of broken vegetation was easy to follow. Branches snapped at heights well above my 6'2" frame. Undergrowth trampled in a distinct path heading east into thicker forest. I maintained constant situational awareness, my rifle at the ready, scanning my sectors as I'd been trained. About 100 yards from the cabin, the trail opened into a small clearing I'd never noticed before. The sight stopped me cold. There, wedged between 3 mature oak trees, was what I can only describe as a nest-like structure. But this was no random collection of storm-blown debris or natural fall. This was construction. Branches had been deliberately woven together to form a crude but effective shelter, roughly 8 feet in diameter and tall enough that I would have had to stretch to touch its apex. Strips of bark had been methodically peeled from nearby trees and interlaced through the branch framework. The precision of the weaving showed clear intent and, more disturbingly, intelligence. The structure had a single entrance, oriented away from the prevailing winds. Inside, the ground had been cleared and packed down, creating a level floor space. There were no tools, no artifacts, nothing that would definitively prove human involvement. But that almost made it worse. This was clearly not the work of local kids or hunters. The construction method was too primitive, too instinctual, yet too complex for any known animal species. Fresh marks in the soil around the structure matched the tracks I'd found by my cabin. They were everywhere, suggesting regular use. Some appeared to be from last night, probably made during the retreat after I fired. The implications hit me hard. This wasn't some random encounter. Whatever I'd shot at had an established presence here, possibly long before I'd moved in. The military trains you to categorize and respond to threats, to put everything into neat boxes of friend, foe, or neutral. But standing there, studying that carefully constructed shelter, I felt my carefully ordered world starting to unravel. This was evidence of something that didn't fit any category in my experience. Something that could think, plan, and build, yet remained hidden from the modern world. I took several photos with my disposable camera, being careful to include objects for scale. Then I retreated back to my cabin, moving more carefully than I'd ever moved on any combat patrol. The forest no longer felt like a refuge from my military past. Instead, it had become something far more complex and dangerous, a territory where I was no longer the apex predator. I called the sheriff's office that morning, knowing I needed to report the shooting incident, regardless of how bizarre the circumstances were. Sheriff Weller arrived around 10 o'clock, his county-issued Ford pickup crunching over the gravel as it pulled up to my cabin. He was a tall man with graying temples, wearing a khaki uniform that had seen better days. "Mr. Kitterman," he said, extending his hand. "Let's start from the beginning." I walked him through the events, keeping my account precise and factual, just as I would have done in any military debriefing. When I mentioned the footsteps and the shadow at the window, I noticed his expression shift slightly, not quite dismissive, but carefully neutral. "Mind if I take a look around?" he asked, pulling out a small notebook. I led him to the window first, showing him the damaged frame and the bag containing the hair sample. He examined it briefly before tucking it into an evidence envelope, though I could tell by his demeanor he was already forming his own conclusions. "Probably a black bear," he said, making notes. "They've been known to get curious about cabins, especially if they smell food." We followed the trail to the nest structure. Sheriff Weller circled it once, his boots crushing the morning frost. He took several photos with his department-issued camera, but seemed more interested in checking the surrounding area for signs of human activity. Cigarette butts, beer cans, anything that might suggest local troublemakers. "Look," I said, pointing to one of the clearer tracks. "Those are clearly toe impressions, 5 of them, arranged like a human foot." The sheriff crouched down, studying the print. Bears can leave some mighty strange tracks, especially when they're moving on their hind legs. Seen it plenty of times. But something in his voice sounded rehearsed, as if he was reciting from a script he'd used before. He spent another 20 minutes documenting the scene, but his questions felt perfunctory, designed to fill out a report rather than investigate what had really happened. Later that afternoon, Ranger Martinez from the State Wildlife Office showed up. She was younger than the sheriff, early 40s maybe, with the sharp eyes of someone who spent their career studying animal behavior. She took her own set of photos and made plaster casts of the prints, working methodically and saying little. As she was packing up her gear, I walked with her back to her vehicle. "What do you really think made those tracks?" I asked. She paused, glancing back toward the tree line. "Mr. Kitterman, I've studied every predator species in Arkansas. I've tracked bears, cougars, even wolves that occasionally wander down from Missouri." She lowered her voice slightly. "No black bear leaves 5 forward-facing toes like that, and the stride length." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Then what?" I started to ask, but she was already opening her truck door. "My official report will support Sheriff Weller's assessment," she said. "That's all I can really say, but..." She hesitated. "Be careful out here. Maybe consider installing some security lights." I watched her drive away, her words hanging in, the air like the morning mist. The sheriff's report would list this as a bear encounter, filed and forgotten. Ranger Martinez's careful hints suggested she knew more but couldn't or wouldn't speak freely about it. Standing there in my yard, watching the dust settle on the road, I realized I was on my own with this. Whatever was out there, whatever had built that nest and stood at my window, wouldn't be explained away by official reports or conventional wildlife biology. The authorities had given me their rehearsed responses, their practiced skepticism, leaving me with more questions than answers. I looked down at my copy of the incident report. Case number 2023-047. Possible bear. encounter. Property damage reported. Case status closed. The weeks after the shooting incident dragged by like a slow-moving fog. I settled into a new routine, but it wasn't the peaceful retirement I'd imagined. Every morning I'd wake before dawn, check the perimeter of my property and look for signs. Sometimes I'd find them. Broken branches too high for deer. Odd arrangements of stones that hadn't been there the day before. The knocking continued. It would start just before dusk, echoing across the hollows. 2 distinct patterns emerged, 3 quick strikes, followed by 2 slow ones from one ridge, answered by a reverse pattern from another. At first, I tried plotting the locations on my topographical maps, but the sounds seemed to shift, never coming from the same place twice. One evening in late October, I was sitting on my porch cleaning my bow when the familiar silence swept over the forest. The crickets stopped their chorus mid-chirp, and the whippoor-wills went quiet. Through the growing darkness, I caught movement along the tree line, a tall, fluid shape moving between the oaks. It wasn't trying to hide anymore. The figure paused, and I could swear it turned to look at me before melting back into the shadows. My hunting trips changed after that. The joy of stalking deer disappeared, replaced by a constant awareness that I wasn't the only one doing the watching. I'd find myself checking my back trail more than looking ahead for game. The weight of my rifle brought less comfort than it used to. The shooting incident had proved that conventional weapons might only make things worse. The strange thing was, I never felt directly threatened again. It was more like I'd been put on notice. That warning shot I'd fired had drawn a line between us, but not the one I'd intended. Instead of driving whatever it was away, I'd somehow established an uneasy coexistence. They, and I'd begun to think of them as a they rather than an it, seemed to be allowing me to stay, provided I respected certain boundaries. I noticed patterns in their tolerance. They never bothered me when I was gathering firewood near the cabin or working in my small garden. But if I ventured deeper into the hollow where I'd found the nest, the knocking would start immediately, growing louder and more insistent until I retreated. During my morning perimeter checks, I'd sometimes find fresh prints at the edge of my clearing, always just visible enough to be noticed, like a reminder of their presence. The tracks appeared most often after nights when I'd stayed up late with my lights on, or when I'd run my generator longer than usual. It felt like a subtle form of communication, a way of saying, "We're still here, watching." The deer started avoiding my property entirely. At first I thought it was just bad luck, but after 2 weeks without seeing so much as a doe, I realized the area around my cabin had become a dead zone for normal wildlife. The only creatures that seemed unaffected were the owls, which had grown more numerous and vocal, their calls often overlapping with the mysterious knocking at dusk. My military training had taught me to analyze threat patterns, to look for weaknesses and opportunities, but this situation defied conventional tactical thinking. These beings, whatever they were, operated by their own rules. They could have easily overwhelmed my position any night they chose, yet they maintained this strange détente. I found myself spending more time on my porch, watching the forest edge through my binoculars. The actual hunting became secondary, almost a pretense. Instead, I was studying their movements, trying to understand their patterns. Sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, I'd hear them moving through the trees behind my cabin. Heavy, footfalls that no bear could match, branches cracking at heights that would dwarf any man. They were letting me stay, but on their terms. My little piece of the Ozarks wasn't really mine anymore. Maybe it never had been. I was just another tenant in their territory, tolerated as long as I played by rules I was only beginning to understand. I carefully packaged the coarse, dark hair I'd recovered from the splintered wood, along with detailed notes about where and when I'd found it. The university's biology department was only a 3-hour drive away, but I decided to mail it instead. Something held me back from making the trip in person. Maybe the same instinct that keeps you from turning your back on something you can't quite see. 2 weeks passed, then a month. I called twice, getting transferred between departments until Someone promised to look into it. Finally, after 3 months of waiting, a lab technician called. Her voice was flat, rehearsed. "I'm sorry, Mr. Kitterman, but the sample appears to have been lost in processing. These things sometimes happen during cataloguing. These things happen." The words echoed in my head like those knocks in the hills. I wanted to ask how a clearly labelled specimen could simply vanish, but I already knew I wouldn't get a real answer. Whether it was bureaucratic incompetence or something more deliberate, the result was the same. My evidence had disappeared into the void of official channels. The bitterness crept in slowly, like winter seeping into my bones. I stopped answering calls from old army buddies, cancelled my monthly supply runs to town. The forest and its secrets became my whole world, even as they remained just out of reach. The leaves turned and fell, leaving the trees skeletal against the grey sky. My cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt more like a forward operating base, a term I'd hoped to leave behind with my military life. I kept watch through long nights, tracking sounds that didn't belong in these hills. The howls started in late November. They'd echo across the valleys, too deep for coyotes, too structured for wolves. Something about their cadence raised the hair on my neck. They carried meaning, like those knocks had. But I'd learned my lesson about reporting strange sounds. The authorities had made it clear they weren't interested in what stalked these woods. I understood the unspoken arrangement. This was their territory. I was being tolerated, nothing more, nothing more. After 12 months of this uneasy coexistence, I finally admitted defeat. The decision came quietly one morning as I watched the mist roll through leafless trees. These weren't the woods of my childhood anymore. Or maybe they never had been. I listed the cabin with a local realtor, telling my few friends that the woods weren't what they used to be. They nodded, probably assuming I couldn't handle the solitude. The truth was harder to explain. 20 years in the army had taught me when I was outmatched. Sometimes survival meant knowing when to withdraw. Whatever claimed these ridges as territory had made it clear I wasn't welcome here, just tolerated. To this day, I still can't say with certainty what I fired at that night. In combat, we always knew our enemy, their weapons, their tactics, their capabilities. But this was different. The shadow at my window could have been a man, maybe a bear, or something else entirely. Something that's walked these hills since before we had words to name it. I've learned one thing worth passing on. If you venture deep into the Ozarks, carry respect more than firepower. Those ridges and hollows aren't as empty as they seem. Sometimes, when you're watching the forest is watching back. The uncertainty is what haunts me most. Not knowing, that's worse than any enemy I faced in uniform. Thank you for being part of this moment. I'll be here tomorrow, ready to share another story that comforts the soul.